On the surface, Martin Caldwell's life looked unremarkable, almost painfully ordinary. At 35, he worked as an assistant manager at the local KFC franchise on the outskirts of Louisville, Kentucky. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid steady, and Martin had been with the company for nearly a decade. Over the years, he became known to his coworkers as the type of man who kept things running smoothly, meticulous with inventory, unbothered by fast food chaos, and rarely raising his voice. He lived in a modest two-bedroom home with his wife, Denise. They had been married for 11 years, having first met in high school when Martin was the quiet, dependable type and she was the girl who wanted someone who made her feel secure. In their neighborhood, people often described them as a couple who kept to themselves. No children, few friends, but the mortgage was paid on time and the bills were handled without complaint. To their families, nothing about Martin or Denise suggested volatility. They appeared steady, routine-driven people, the kind of pair who might argue over groceries or which movie to watch, but nothing more dramatic. Neither side of the family had reason to imagine that theirs was anything but a normal marriage. Yet beneath the surface, fissures ran silently through their relationship. Denise often felt restless in the predictability Martin built his life around. She wanted excitement, attention, things that her husband's quiet stability could not provide. For Martin, contentment came from routine. He couldn't see why his wife needed more. The small cracks between them grew unnoticed, until they would one day rupture with violent force. A KFC kitchen runs on noise, the hiss of fryers, the slam of refrigerator doors, the constant orders barked from headsets. But in between the chaos of a Friday dinner rush, there was always time for whispers. Restaurants thrived on gossip, and this store was no different. Out of earshot of management, employees traded stories about one another like currency. Martin had been around long enough to know not to believe everything he heard. He had dealt with rumors about employees sneaking food home, couples messing around in the freezer, even someone smoking in the bathroom. But when the talk shifted toward his wife, he felt the ground shift beneath him. It started innocently, joking banter from one of the younger cashiers, who had noticed Denise spending a lot of time in the break room during Martin's long shifts. She mentioned Denise's laughter, the playful nudges she shared with Jeremy Wallace, a fry cook who had joined the store just over a year ago. Jeremy was a natural charmer, always wearing a grin that seemed designed to disarm. Employees liked him because he could turn the stress of a busy rush into a game, cracking jokes, moving fast, making the work feel lighter. But to Martin, something about Jeremy always felt careless, even sloppy. The kid had no respect for rules, always showing up late or leaving work half done, with a shrug and an easy excuse. At first, Martin brushed off the insinuation. He trusted Denise, or at least wanted to. She was his wife, after all, and they had been together for too long to think she'd become entangled with someone like Jeremy. But then came the little things. Denise had grown distant at home. She lingered on her phone late at night, laughing at texts she refused to explain. She began volunteering to pick Martin up from late shifts, yet sometimes mysteriously arrived late, breathless, with vague excuses. Twice, he caught the faintest trace of cologne on her shirt, different from his own, and though he wanted to dismiss it, a knot of suspicion began to form in his chest. What gnawed at him most wasn't evidence, but the possibility. Martin was a man who liked control, order, routine. The idea that something so personal could be slipping away from him, right under his nose and in a restaurant he helped manage, made his stomach churn. But the whispers didn't stop. Employees snickered behind his back in ways that he began to notice. He caught one of them quickly averting her eyes when Denise's name came up in conversation. He didn't need them to say it outright. He already knew what they were implying. Denise, meanwhile, didn't hide her admiration for Jeremy at work. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, lingered beside him during slow moments, and once, Martin came around the corner unexpectedly to find them pressed a little too close at the soda fountain. They had jumped apart, but the image burned itself into his mind. For weeks, Martin carried the weight in silence. He said nothing to Denise, nothing to Jeremy, but his demeanor began to shift. He grew quieter, colder, his jaw set tighter at work. Those who had once seen him as mild-mannered noticed a tension in him. For the first time, Martin Caldwell looked like a man simmering inside. What he didn't know then was that his silence was a countdown. And when the moment finally came, it would erupt in violence that nobody in that kitchen could ever forget. The night it all came crashing down began like any other. It was a humid July Friday in Kentucky, the kind where the air feels thick enough to choke. Martin had finished his shift earlier than usual, but a small detail nagged at him. Some paperwork left behind in the office, end-of-month reports he didn't want to put off. Denise was supposed to be home, but when he stepped through their front door, the house was empty. Her car was gone, and no note lay on the counter. That knot in his chest, the one he had been nursing for weeks, tightened until it felt like it was strangling him. Martin decided to swing by the KFC, convincing himself he'd just grab his files and head home. He told himself it was nothing, that Denise was probably running an errand or with her sister or anywhere that had nothing to do with Jeremy Wallace. But deep down, a darker thought beckoned, one he wouldn't allow himself to name. The parking lot was dark when he arrived, save for the faint glow spilling from the kitchen. The dining area was closed, chairs flipped on tables, but there were still signs of life inside. Light laughter drifting down the hall. He froze. That sound had no place there after hours. Martin pushed through the swinging door to the back. The laughter grew louder, then softened to muffled giggles, punctuated by a rustling sound. Every step toward the stockroom seemed to reverberate through his chest like a drum. His heartbeat quickened, thudding in his ears as if warning him to turn around, to leave before he saw something he couldn't unsee. But he didn't turn back. With a trembling hand, he shoved open the steel stockroom door. The hinges groaned, and in an instant, the breath left his body. There, between stacks of resin shelves and cardboard boxes, was Denise. Her blouse was half open, her hair disheveled, and she was locked in a frantic tangle with Jeremy. His arms were around her waist, his uniform shirt hanging loose, both of them lost in their forbidden moment, until they looked up and saw Martin's silhouette in the doorway. The world seemed to freeze. Denise's mouth opened, but no words came. Jeremy scrambled back, fumbling, trying to speak, but all Martin heard was the ringing in his ears. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was alive, raw, right in front of him. In that instant, Martin felt something break inside him. What had been weeks of gnawing doubt snapped into fury so overwhelming that all coherent thought dissolved. The doubt, the whispers, the lies, they had finally been proven true, and the sight of them burned into him so deeply it erased every ounce of reason he had left. His hands were already curling into fists as he stepped fully into the room. For a few suspended seconds, the stockroom was a silent tableau, 3 figures frozen in shock. The only sound was the distant hum of the walk-in refrigerators. Denise's eyes widened, her lips trembling as if to form an apology that never came. Jeremy muttered something, a half-formed excuse, a nervous stammer, but Martin couldn't hear any of it. His mind had gone quiet, replaced with a pulse of white-hot rage. The man who had spent his life clinging to order and routine felt it all dissolve in a single moment. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was flesh and blood, right in front of him. The woman who had sworn vows at an altar was in the arms of a man he had barely trusted to clean fry baskets. Martin's breathing quickened, harsh and animal-like. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles cracked. "You," he rasped, his voice choking on the words. "Here? In my place?" Jeremy, still scrambling to pull his pants up, raised his hands as if to calm him. "Man, listen. It's not what it looks like. Just chill." But the words only fueled the fire. They sounded cowardly, pathetic, and insulting all at once. To Martin, it was proof that Jeremy had no shame in what he'd done. That Denise had no shame in letting it happen. His eyes darted across the room and landed on a heavy metal tool that had been left on the shelf, a wrench used during equipment repairs. His hand moved toward it without thought, as if something primal had taken over. As his fingers closed around the cold steel, time seemed to blur. Denise gasped when she saw him raise it. She stepped forward, her voice cracking with panic. "Martin, stop. Just listen to me. But it was too late. With a guttural roar, Martin swung. The first strike wasn't carefully aimed. It was a wild release of weeks of suspicion, heartbreak, and rage condensed into a single violent moment. Jeremy took the brunt of it, stumbling back against the shelves as blood spattered across the cardboard boxes stacked behind him. The sight only fueled Martin's frenzy. Denise screamed, trying to pull him back, but when her hands touched his arms, the betrayal flashed again in his mind. In his blind fury, he turned on her too. His vision red, every strike indistinguishable between anger at Jeremy or at her. Love, trust, and years of marriage were drowned beneath the surge of vengeance. In those moments, Martin was not a husband, nor a manager, nor even the man his coworkers had known. He became something else entirely. Rage made flesh, destruction without pause. When he finally stopped, the wrench slipped from his hands, clattering against the tile floor. The only sound left was his own ragged breathing and the hum of the freezer. Denise and Jeremy lay crumpled on the floor, still and broken, their blood seeping into the grease-stained linoleum. Martin staggered back, chest heaving, the enormity of what he had done slowly cutting through the haze. For the first time, clarity returned, and with it a dreadful realization. There was no going back. The wrench slipped from Martin's trembling hand and hit the tile with a hollow clang that echoed through the cramped stockroom. His chest heaved like a bellows, each breath ragged. His arms shaking as though the rage had drained from his body and left only weakness behind. The metallic smell of blood crept into his nostrils, thick and undeniable. It mingled with the familiar fryer grease and raw chicken that always lingered in the air, creating a nauseating mix that nearly made him gag. He stumbled a step backward, pressing his hand against the doorframe for balance, his eyes darting between the two motionless bodies. Jeremy lay sprawled against the shelving, his head at an unnatural angle, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Denise's lifeless form was closer, slumped on the floor with blood streaking across her blouse. Her once familiar face, his wife's face, was twisted in shock, forever frozen in the moment of betrayal and terror. The sight cut him in two. The woman he had loved, and the woman who had betrayed him, locked in a silence that would never break again. Martin couldn't process it, couldn't accept that he was the cause. His mind raced in circles, alternating between justification and horror. They did this. She did this. Both of them. I just snapped. The thought offered a sick kind of comfort, but it never lasted. Reality forced itself back into focus when he glanced down at his hands, slick with blood that wasn't his own. He sank to his knees, his breathing fast and shallow, staring at the red staining his palms. For a few moments, all he could hear was his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Then the stockroom's hum, the refrigeration unit, the buzzing fluorescent light, crept back in, reminding him that life outside the room hadn't stopped. The panic finally settled in. If someone walked in, if anyone came back for a forgotten bag or late-night shift check, it would be over. They would see everything. Desperate, Martin pulled himself up and began dragging Denise's body first, the weight heavier than he ever imagined. Her limp arms scraped against the tile as he pulled her toward the walk-in freezer. Every movement left a streak of crimson behind, lines on the white floor that only deepened his dread. When she was inside, he fumbled the door shut, sealing away her body in the cold darkness. With shaking arms, he did the same to Jeremy, forcing his coworker's body beside hers, as if locking up evidence would erase what happened. But the stains remained, blood smeared on the floor, splattered against boxes, even specks darkening his own shoes and uniform. His clumsy hands tried wiping them with a cleaning rag, but panic made him sloppy. The harder he tried, the worse it looked. Standing in the center of the stockroom, Martin realized he was only making matters worse. His chest tightened as the truth became unbearable, pounding through his head. This isn't going away. You can't clean this. You can't undo this. And for the first time that night, beneath the rage and betrayal, Martin understood fear. Martin staggered through the stockroom, his hands slick with sweat and blood, his mind scrambling for answers. Years of being methodical and orderly in his work should have prepared him to handle emergencies. But this wasn't a fryer spill or mislabeled shipment. This was murder. He grabbed a mop and bucket from the supply closet, the same ones he had used hundreds of times to clean the greasy tile floor after closing shifts. But tonight, the stains weren't spills of soda or chicken batter. They were thick, dark smears of blood. As he pushed the mop across the floor, the water turned pink, then crimson, until the bucket looked more like a crime itself than a tool to erase one. Every attempt to wipe away the evidence only made the streak spread. Droplets remained lodged in the grooves of the tiles. Speckles remained on the boxes of frozen fries and bags. A flower. A sharp swipe of his hand against one box left a bloody print, and when he smeared it, it only got worse. He cursed under his breath, thrashing at the stains. Panic made him careless, and every move created new proof of what he had done. Martin tried to think like an investigator. Cameras. He suddenly remembered the security system. A grainy set of cameras that overlooked the dining area, the kitchen, and, unfortunately for him, parts of the hall near the stockroom. His anger had been too blinding to notice if that tiny red light was blinking when he entered. Terror clawed at the back of his mind. His every step, his every move, may already have been recorded. He turned his attention back to the freezer. He thought if the bodies were hidden well enough, maybe there would be time to figure something out. But the freezer wasn't designed to hide corpses. It was lined with metal racks filled with frozen chicken, vegetables, and boxed biscuits. Denise and Jeremy lay slumped on the floor inside, their bodies grotesquely out of place amid the sterile stacks of food. The sight nearly made Martin vomit. Still shaking, he slammed the freezer door shut and pulled the latch, as though he could lock away not just their bodies, but the entire reality of what had happened. He whispered to himself like a prayer, "It'll be fine. Give me time. No one saw. No one knows." But deep down, he knew otherwise. He knew the other employees gossiped. He knew they had noticed Denise spending more time at the restaurant. And he knew in his heart that both families would wonder where they had gone when they didn't return home. His cover-up wasn't clever. It was clumsy, desperate, and doomed from the start. By the time he walked out of the restaurant and pulled the door closed behind him, the night was unbearably still. The cicadas whirred in the trees, the same familiar summer sound that had always made him feel comfort at the end of long shifts. But now, every note felt mocking. A cruel reminder that the ordinary world was still turning, while his life had been shattered beyond recognition. Martin drove home in silence, his grip on the wheel so tight his knuckles blanched, every headlight that passed making him flinch. He told himself that, if he could just get through one night, he could figure out what to do in the morning. But the truth was already chasing him. The mess left in the stockroom spoke louder than any words he could conjure. The blood marked his guilt in lines he couldn't mop away. And the freezer behind that locked door was less a hiding place and more a time bomb, waiting to explode. Martin barely slept that night. He lay in bed beside Denise's empty space, staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on him like a weight. His heart never slowed. His mind never quit replaying the scene in the stockroom. Denise's scream, Jeremy's pleading, the wrench crashing down again and again. Every time he closed his eyes, their faces returned, bloodied and contorted, taunting him from behind the lids. By morning, the world outside marched on as though nothing had happened. Children waited for school buses. Neighbors mowed their lawns. The routine of life continued, and for Martin, that cruel normalcy made him paranoid. Each sound outside his window could have been the police. Each passing car could have been coming for him. It didn't take long. When Denise's sister couldn't reach her by phone, she called Martin. His voice cracked as he tried to sound calm, saying Denise must have gone out somewhere. But the sister wasn't convinced. By noon, she had reported her missing. Jeremy's absence didn't go unnoticed either. He failed to show up for his shift that same morning. His coworkers began calling him too, no answer. Whispers spread quickly, suspicion weaving through the small network of employees who had been gossiping for weeks. The manager of the KFC, alarmed by the no-shows, decided to swing by the store before opening. When she entered the stockroom, She didn't have to guess long. The streaks of blood that Martin thought he had cleaned were still visible, faint smears leading toward the walk-in freezer. When she pulled the heavy door open, she stumbled back in horror. Within an hour, the police had cordoned off the restaurant. Yellow tape fluttered in the morning breeze as officers moved in and out, their expressions somber. The freezer revealed everything. There was no clever cover-up, no mystery to solve. Instead, it was brutality left in plain sight. Detectives already had a suspect in mind. Surveillance cameras confirmed it even before the bodies were wheeled out. Martin Caldwell had entered the store at the exact window when everything had happened. They watched the footage, grainy but undeniable, showing him moving toward the stockroom and leaving nearly an hour later, alone. That afternoon, Martin's fragile silence shattered when police knocked on his door. He opened it to find uniformed officers on the porch, their jaws set hard. His shoulders slumped almost immediately. There was no fight in him. He didn't ask why they were there. He already knew. "Martin Caldwell?" the detective asked. "Yes," he muttered, his voice hollow. "You're under arrest for the murders of Denise Caldwell and Jeremy Wallace." The words hit him like stones. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Martin's neighbors peeked through blinds and from porches, watching as the quiet man they thought they knew was led away in silence. At the precinct, Martin didn't hold out long. Faced with the evidence, the camera footage, the blood on his shoes, the fingerprints on the wrench, he broke. His confession tumbled out in jagged bursts, half justification and half grief. "I caught them. They were together. I snapped. I couldn't stop myself." Over and over he repeated it, as though the words might absolve him, but each time, they only solidified his guilt. The town that had once thought of Martin as dependable and ordinary now knew him only as a killer. And though he had acted in a moment of rage, that one night in July would define him forever. The case of Commonwealth versus Martin Caldwell moved swiftly through the Kentucky court system, propelled by the community's outrage and the sheer brutality of the crime. The evidence was overwhelming: surveillance footage, bloodstains, fingerprints on the wrench, and Martin's own confession. Still, his defense attorneys tried to build a narrative that he had been pushed beyond reason in a sudden, devastating moment of discovery. The prosecution painted a different picture. They described Martin not as a victim of rage, but as a man who chose violence over restraint. The jury was reminded again and again of the details. Multiple strikes, both victims brutally beaten, and the clumsy attempt to hide the bodies in the freezer. This wasn't a single blind swing, they argued. This was purposeful slaughter. Witness testimony cut to the quick. Denise's family filled the first rows every day, faces etched with grief. Her sister sobbed through most of her time on the stand, recounting Denise's last unanswered phone calls, while Jeremy's parents sat stiff as stone, rage simmering behind their eyes. Coworkers took the stand as well, recounting the gossip, the laughter Denise had shared with Jeremy, and the chilling memory of Martin growing withdrawn and quiet in the weeks leading up to the murders. The defense leaned heavily on the plea of temporary insanity, the idea that Martin had been so psychologically shattered by betrayal that he simply snapped. They brought in a psychologist who described the mental break that can occur in moments of extreme stress, urging jurors to see Martin as a man who acted irrationally, not as a cold-blooded killer. But the prosecution countered effectively. "Snapping," they said, "does not excuse drenching an entire stockroom in blood, dragging two bodies into a freezer, and attempting to cover the crime. He knew what he was doing when he dragged them. He knew what he was doing when he tried to clean the floor." For 2 weeks, the jury listened, debated, and weighed Martin's fate. When they finally returned, the answer was clear: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Martin sat slumped, thinner than when he was arrested, his face hollow, eyes downcast. The judge's words were measured, heavy with the weight of finality. "Mr. Caldwell, your actions were not the product of sudden madness alone, but deliberate choices that took 2 lives in an act of violence that horrified this community. Jealousy and betrayal may wound, but they do not justify murder. Therefore, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck, sealing his fate. As he was escorted from the courtroom, Martin glanced briefly at the gallery. Denise's sister refused to look at him. Jeremy's father glared with an expression that burned through him like fire. The last thing Martin saw before being led away was a courtroom united not in sympathy, but in condemnation. The trial was over, and so was Martin Caldwell's life as he once knew it. The husband, the assistant manager, the quiet man from the suburbs, he was gone. What remained was only a convicted double murderer, destined to spend his days behind concrete walls and razor wire until death claimed him.